Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Yale Club. My name is Barry Singer, and I'm the proprietor of Chartwell Booksellers. It's delightful to have you here in lieu of having you at Chartwell Booksellers. This is a much larger space. This is going to be a very special evening, I believe, of Churchillian conversation in celebration of the publication here in the United States of Boris Johnson's book, The Churchill Factor, How One Man Made History. Thank you to the Anglosphere Society and St. George's Society. Thank you, Amanda Bowman, and to Dennis Barham, and to John Shannon of St. George's Society for making this evening possible. Thank you to Riverhead Books for giving us The Churchill Factor. Here, here. We are sharing company this evening with two gentlemen who have performed the impossible. Paul Reid, on my left, has impossibly managed to complete William Manchester's seemingly uncompletable biographical trilogy of Winston Churchill, The Last Lion. No book in my bookstore over the past 25 years has been more inquired about than the final volume of The Last Lion. Initially, the questions were, will Manchester ever finish it? And then when the answer clearly sadly became no, along came Paul Reid and rescued us all. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. It's not mine.
Okay. Boris Johnson, Mayor of London, candidate for Parliament, has impossibly found the time to write a book about Winston Churchill that manages to make everything in it seem new. I have read it, and I'm telling you, as much as I've read about Churchill, there is so much in this book that seems fresh because of the author's voice and the research that he has put into this book. He has a light-hearted erudition, an adventurous intellectual curiosity, and above all else, something that I believe is unique among politicians. He has wit. At this moment, he needs no introduction. In fact, I realize he's already been introduced, but we do have someone here this evening who is uniquely qualified to introduce Mr. Johnson from a Churchillian perspective. And that is Winston Churchill's granddaughter, Edwina Sands. Ladies and gentlemen.
All right.
Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Barry. Well, my grandfather, Winston Churchill, was a man in full, and I think maybe Boris is too. Boris has captured my grandfather in many of his facets: his bravery, his humanity, his wit and wisdom, which bubbles over like Paul Reid champagne against the backdrop of terrible times. Now, Grandpapa found time to do a lot of things. I think Boris does too, maybe even more. But Grandpapa wrote a lot of things. As we know, history not only made it, but he wrote about it. He said, "History will be kind to me. I intend to write it myself." Now, I think he would. He may be up on a fluffy cloud with a cherubic smile reading Boris's book. I think he would enjoy it very much. And I do too.
Thank you, Ed.
Boris.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like you to, do I say something? Do you want me to speak? Do you want me to say something? Okay, well, since I've now been introduced 3 times, I really feel I should just try and get the ball back over the net. Ladies and gentlemen, say what an absolute joy it is to be here tonight in the city of my birth. By the way, a fact I normally conceal from the London electorate, and I'd be obliged if you don't pass that on. Churchill, of course, had a long and complicated relationship with America, and he loved America, but he sometimes caused amazement amongst Americans by the sheer quantity of alcohol that he consumed, and I'm delighted that. I remember he came once famously during the in the 20s, and someone reproved him for his consumption of alcohol and said, "Mr. Churchill, alcohol rageth and stingeth like a serpent." And he said, "I've been looking for a drink like that all my life." And then you'll remember that of course his feelings were complicated even more after the First World War, when America gained in power globally and Britain diminished, and it became clear that America was actually trying pretty much to nudge Britain off its position as the number one world power. And Churchill felt this very keenly, of course, because he was an ardent British imperialist, if nothing else. And he said that he was sounding off to Eddie Marsh, his private secretary, who said, we should kiss America on both cheeks. And Churchill said, yes, but not on all 4. And so I'm just pointing that out. I'm pointing because it was a complicated feeling he had. It was the land of his mother. He venerated, he loved America. But then finally, I think it would be fair to say, ladies and gentlemen, he ended up in a state of unqualified admiration for America and everything America stands for. And his last cabinet meeting, he gets them all in. And he says in 1955, he says he has 2 points that he wishes to pass on to his colleagues. He says, number 1, man is spirit. I don't know quite what he meant by that, but it sounds profound. And the second thing was never be separated from the Americans. And I think that was very good advice, and all succeeding British governments, if they're sensible, have done the same thing. So it's great to be here tonight. I think we're going to be having a question and answer session of some kind. I'm going to hand the conch back immediately, but thank you very much, everybody, for coming along tonight, and thank you for joining in a celebration of Winston Churchill, not only the greatest Briton, I think, that there has been in the last 500 years, but also a man who understood the vital importance of the Anglosphere. So it couldn't be more appropriate that this occasion is being sponsored by the Anglosphere Society and by the St. George's Society, set up in 1770. Things didn't go too well, obviously, for that society, but good idea. Thank you very much.
We're just going to set the mics to make sure you can hear everyone. I'm going to fire a few questions at these gentlemen, and we'll see what we see. Without giving your entire book away, Mr. Johnson, because we would like to sell a few tonight. If you would, the Churchill factor, can you define it for us?
Yeah, Churchill's greatness was his willingness to stick to his guns even when everybody else thought he was wrong, and never to give in, as he would have put it. That was fundamentally what it was about. It was his absolute determination to stick to what he had decided, rightly or wrongly, and I'm afraid quite often it was wrongly, was the right thing to do.
Often?
Sometimes. And there's no question he made catastrophic blunders. Gallipoli, the abdication crisis, the independence of India, he got totally wrong. No one can read today what he had to say about Mahatma Gandhi without a faint prickle of embarrassment, or even worse. He totally miscued that. But when it came to the big question in the late 1930s, he was absolutely right. And the reason he was, having read a certain amount about it now, not as much as many people here, but the reason I think that he was able to get it right is because he was a brilliant reporter, a brilliant journalist, and he saw what was happening in Nazi Germany, and he was able to communicate it and explain it.
Mr. Reid, your book is not entitled The Churchill Factor, but do you agree that there is such a thing?
Well, having read Boris's book, absolutely. And in fact, at the beginning of your book, Boris, you talk about being a little kid memorizing Churchill's speeches and marching around the house. And when I was 5 or 6, my old man, who had gone to the Naval Academy, used to flip pancakes on Saturday mornings, and on our Victrola, he'd play Churchill's speeches. And he had his Annapolis bathrobe on and a seaman's cap, and he's flipping pancakes. I'm about this big, and he's saying, "Polly, you listen to that man. Listen to that man. He saved Western civilization." Well, I was looking forward to going playing marbles or something. I didn't want to. But he was right. And 55 years later, I spent 8.5 years, as I like to think, with Churchill, with Winston. And by God, at the end of that experience, he had the heart, and a lot of people have heart. Muhammad Ali has heart. Churchill had the wit. A lot of people have wit. Rodney Dangerfield has wit. And you can go on and on. He was a journalist, a politician, but first and foremost was that spirit. And yeah, he stuck to his guns. Of course, he changed guns frequently, but...
Well, but he may have changed guns, but that was only because the other side, or rather, the guns changed underneath him. If I mix my metaphors, but if when he switched parties, as he did in 1904 and then again in the 20s, that was because the Tories welched on free trade, and so actually you could say that he did stick to his guns in the sense that he stuck to free trade. I think his principles. You can make a pretty good case that he was consistent in his intellectual principles there.
I believe that too. I mean, I think it was just about 100 years ago that he and the Liberal Party brought the first vestiges of what we would call welfare and employment insurance to England. This was a good 30 years before FDR was trepidatious in even suggesting anything like that in this country. And when the Liberals went south on him a decade later, he, as he would say, re-ratted to the Conservatives because they, by then, stood for what he had consistently believed in. And now we're on the verge of the 30s, and that people have asked me Churchill's finest hour. I mean, it's the hour, the years, the decades that he wasn't even in office.
Yeah. You mean when he was out there alone campaigning against Nazism and against German rearmament and sounding the alarm? I think people have genuinely forgotten. That's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. People have genuinely forgotten how much support there was for in the mid-30s, support for Nazism. I mean, look at what the stuff that Lloyd George was saying, the stuff the Daily Mail was saying, all the aristocrats were saying, they much preferred the Nazis or fascism to communism, because communism meant taking away their estates, and they were very much against that. So I'm afraid the British upper class don't come out very well from the 1930s, and then in 1940, even in 1940, he's got huge pressures on him to do a deal. And many of you will have read John Lukács's fantastic book, 5 Days in May, about how Halifax and Chamberlain were putting pressure to agree to the overtures from Hitler. And in those great meetings in May 1940, if Churchill had not been there, I really think, if you imagine a great Monty Python hand coming down and taking him out of the cabinet room, it would have been an absolute catastrophe. This country, I mean, not this country, obviously, because this country wasn't involved and didn't get involved for 2 years and 4 months, by the way. But Britain would, I think, have made an accommodation with a spectacularly evil, racist regime that would have produced a kind of Nazi European Union in Europe. And it would have been, Hitler, to cut a long story short, might well have won. And I think that is, I think most reputable historians, and a lot of reputable historians here tonight, would support that view, Paul. Would you not agree?
Oh, I completely agree. And what I remember moved me, my eyes opened, those months of May, June, July of 1940, when England was expecting an invasion, when Halifax and the King of Sweden and that bumbler, the former king and his American wife were more or less dished off to the Bahamas. Henry Ford would not sell a weapon to Churchill in England because it was cash and carry. Absolutely. And he thought by the end of the year, Henry Ford did, he's going to be dealing in German marks if he deals with the English. The Americans, my country, our country, I was just shamed and shocked by those 18 months between May of 1940 and finally Pearl Harbor that Churchill couldn't beg, borrow, or steal anything. And the famous 50 destroyers that he begged for that Franklin Roosevelt sent him were junk. And only 9 of them got there by the beginning of 1941. Everything we did for England in 1940, and it's spun so differently, had a price, and it was worthless. And FDR went before Congress and gloated in the fact that we have just traded 50 overage destroyers, and he stressed that, 50 pieces of junk for...
Bathtubs they were. Never mind.
Bases.
We were grateful in the end.
Well, Churchill used to, I mean, at night after a couple of brandies with Jacques Colville, I mean, he would let loose about the Americans want to.
Well, in public, he said it was the most unsordid act in human history.
A year and a half later, when Lend-Lease.
That's right.
But during 1940, when we were cash and carry, and at one point he suggested that everyone in England donate their wedding rings to be melted down into all of, 95 pounds of gold to shame the Americans into doing something. We just didn't do anything. And that was eye-opening. And of course, that's England's finest hour. And
I don't want to whinge about this, folks, but even Lend-Lease was quite a tough deal when it came through, Paul. I mean, you remember, I think our last gold, we had to get our last gold from South Africa. We had to agree to certain terms to stop trading with Latin America and to leave markets open there. It's just, and do you know when we paid the UK government paid the last Lend-Lease check to the United States? Georgette, do you know what year it was?
I think it was 2004.
2008. A guy called Ed Balls signed a check for a very large sum of money. Absolutely, so we honour our debts. But the point I want to make is that it was a financial arrangement, and Churchill in public said it was the most unsordid act in human history, and in private he said we are being skinned and flayed to the bone. So when I spoke earlier of his slight ambivalence about relations with America, I think that was one of the reasons. And one of the biggest diplomatic mistakes he made in the end was not going to FDR's funeral in spite of everything. I wonder what your view is. Why didn't he go to FDR's funeral? I couldn't really work out to my satisfaction why he hadn't done that. It seemed to.
I thought he's such a complex man. The war he knew would be over within a week or 2 or 3 or 4. It was 3, I think, mid-April of 45. On the other hand, he could be persnickety, and FDR had eclipsed him at Tehran and at Yalta, and the Americans, FDR had told them as soon as the war is over, my boys are coming home, which meant for Churchill, the Russians would be on the English Channel again. And so on the one hand, he was very busy. On the other hand, I think he was always, over the last couple of years, miffed at Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson did tell Sir Martin Gilbert that Lyndon Johnson, president when Churchill died, didn't go to Churchill's funeral, and it was in direct retaliation. Now, this is Johnson being small. Churchill was a busy man. Not that Lyndon wasn't, but FDR was Lyndon's boss in 1945, and when Churchill died, Johnson had been in Walter Reed for a few days with pneumonia, but he could have gone, and he sent instead Chief Justice Warren of the Supreme Court, not even the Vice President. It just shows how 20, 25 years later, the small things that don't go into the memoirs bubble to the surface. And in the back row of St. Paul's Cathedral for Churchill's funeral, in a civilian suit, was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who took himself over at his own expense, and he wasn't even an official guest.
Good for him.
So,
Good for
yeah,
him.
good for Ike. I like Ike.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, great.
Both of these gentlemen have written in their books, I think quite honestly and with unusual candor, about all of the many blunders that Churchill has been accused of throughout his career. I'm fascinated by these. I personally find that many of them are not as they appear, and that is how both of them have written about them. But a question occurred to me, which was that, to begin with you, Mr. Johnson, what is your favorite Churchill blunder?
Well, it's a hotly contested field, and I think if you look at it, he did so many wonderful things in defiance of all logic and common sense. He kept going up in airplanes, even though it was obvious that they were death traps, and his own instructors were being killed. One day they'd be teaching him, the next day they'd kill themselves, and he still got in a plane with the next instructor. I mean, he was crazy about aviation, but I support him there. I support him completely. I don't think you can really rate it a blunder, because he pioneered flight. He started the Royal Naval Air Squadron. He was the instigator, therefore, of the RAF and the whole thing. And there's a sort of list of his canonical blunders, and they include things like Gallipoli, which was obviously a disaster, very difficult to make a good case for Gallipoli. 180,000 people died, and on the Allied side alone, and it's very hard to work out what on earth it was supposed to achieve. I mean, Paul, you may have some, strategically, I don't really see how it was ever going to work, Gallipoli. Antwerp, I think, pretty good actually. I mean, it's not a bad blunder, because he gets, he was much attacked for it at the time, but he probably delayed the German capture of the rest of the Channel ports, I would say, a few days at any rate. He held on to Antwerp for a few more days. I think that was a success. I think my favourite blunders of Churchill are the Russian imbroglio, where he stood out virtually alone in trying to stop communism getting a grip in Russia. He supported these Russian generals, or Kolchak and Denikin and all those guys, and it almost came off. They almost got to Moscow, and imagine if they had. We would have been spared 70 years of an absolutely ghastly tyranny in Russia. That's my view of communism anyway. It may not be the view of everybody here. I sincerely hope it is. That's almost my number. But my favourite blunder of Churchill is the abdication, where I think where he was on the right side, wasn't he? Because he thought the king should jolly well be allowed to marry any girl he wanted. And and that is really, I think most people would now say that was the right approach, and that's the modern view. And didn't pay off for him, because everybody disagreed at the time. But I think it looks good now. That's my view.
Have you a favorite?
Well, I don't have a favorite in the sense of, boy, I'm glad he made that blunder. I think it was a blunder in 1945 in the election for him. And Clementine, his wife, and his daughter Mary, and his secretary said, don't put this in the speech. And what he was putting in the speech was that if the socialists, the Labour Party, are elected, England will need a Gestapo. Wrong word. These 1.5 million men coming home had been fighting the Nazis, and to say to England, if you elect these people, they're going to bring a Gestapo, it didn't work. And I think that's why he lost the election. I mean, it sounds simple. It was an important factor. One of the big reasons that they just didn't want to hear in that moment of victory that here they come again, the Gestapo. Right on the heels of that, he initiated Operation Unthinkable. That was the code name for the destruction of Russia, to suit up with the former German army and move east. And this caused Eisenhower and Montgomery and everyone to pull their hair out. And Brooke, General Brooke, the chief of the German British Imperial Staff, wrote in his diary,
Alan Brooke, yeah.
Alan Brooke, my God, Churchill wants to start World War III, and the old war isn't even over for 2 weeks.
Yeah. But hang on, I mean, I know it was crazy, but in principle, the idea of trying to avert tyranny in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union was not a wholly stupid one.
No.
What it showed to me, what that Operation Unthinkable shows to me, is the incredible flexibility of Churchill's mind. He always thinking about what the next move, the next play might be. So, of course, it sounds deranged to give the Wehrmacht back their weapons, but it shows at least that he's thinking ahead. And so the next year in Fulton, Missouri, he goes to make this speech about the Iron Curtain having been drawn across Europe, and everybody's horrified. And Truman actually, although he'd seen the speech in advance, denounces it, or says he hadn't seen it or approved it, and everybody's scandalized by the level of Churchill's hostility to the Soviet Union. But actually, in the next few years, they realize he's completely right, and that his analysis about the Cold War was correct, and that there is a police state springing up all over Eastern Europe. And in that Fulton, Missouri speech, he correctly prophesies also the final collapse of communism. So, you can say the Operation Unthinkable was wrong, and certainly nobody took him up on it, and nobody wanted to do it. But there was a soundness in his logic and a relentless intellectual rigor that he applied to the situation. And ultimately he was vindicated in his analysis of what was happening in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union.
That's right, and this was throughout his life. This was the case. He wrote in the 1920s about the future bioengineering of food and possibly people, cloning. This is in 1920 in one of his essays. He came out with these things, though invariably at the wrong time as far as public opinion was concerned. As during the 30s, when he was anti-fascist, and Charles Lindbergh and many in Britain were saying, "Oh, what's the problem?" He saw the problems before others did, but then he would adapt, as he did at Fulton, Missouri. And I just absolutely love the last words he spoke in the House of Commons as PM in 1945, when he invented the concept of mutually assured destruction. Dwight Eisenhower pretty much thought of an atomic bomb or a hydrogen bomb as just a bigger and better cannon, which Churchill had too 10 years earlier. But by 1955, he had seen that humanity wouldn't survive, and
no, but in the 20s, he's already talking about bombs the size of an orange that could destroy.
Right.
He's well ahead of it. Oh no, he was well ahead on the atomic bomb.
But when it came to fruition, he saw, before Eisenhower or anyone relevant, the perils to humanity, and he ended that career. I don't think he ever spoke in the House again, other than a tribute to Lloyd George. He said, "I wonder what would happen if God tired of humanity. I mean, this was syrupy, over the top, but his point was, and he said, the little children, what will become of them? What will become of humanity? And along with the message to never give in to his cabinet and to never separate from the Americans, was, for the last 20 years of his life, this crusade to address the insanity of hydrogen bombs.
Yeah.
And in that, he was ahead of his time.
He was. He was a wonderfully compassionate guy. That's the thing about Churchill. He was filled with sympathy. I think it was the words Attlee says of him. I think it might have been in his retirement. He had sympathy, incredibly deep sympathy for ordinary people all over the world, and he really did. I think he wasn't a warmonger at all. He wasn't an aggressive guy, and he was a very tolerant guy. And there's a wonderful story that Nicholas Soames told me about a terrible time, and I think it was in the war, when one of his cabinet ministers had been a Tory cabinet minister, been caught in the usual way on a park bench with a guardsman at 6 o'clock in the morning in February, and the news of this unhappy incident was brought to Churchill at Chartwell by the chief whip. And Churchill doesn't turn round from that famous upright desk that you can see in your mind's eye, and he says, because this guy was a friend of his, he says, "Do you mean to say that so and so has been caught in Hyde Park with a guardsman?" And the chief whip says, "Yes, Prime Minister." On a park bench. "Yes, Prime Minister." At 6 o'clock in the morning. "Yes, Prime Minister." "In this weather?" "Yes, Prime Minister." "By God, man, it makes you proud to be British," said Churchill. And that shows a certain sort of, a kind of, a greatness of soul. He had a greatness of soul. You know, the veracity of that story is being chased down by Alan Packwood and all the archivists. I'm sure it's true. But it shows his, he grew up in a very rackety kind of household. His mother was an extraordinary woman. He was not censorious, was he, Edwina? He was not censorious. He was not judgmental about how people lived their lives, and it's important to remember that. And I hope that people will, he was a liberal, although he was a conservative. He was a Whig, if you know what I mean. He was a Victorian progressive with a streak of bohemian raffishness, I would say.
This question occurred to me this week. We all know that without Churchill in the 1930s and 40s, what would have happened? How Churchill changed history and combated Adolf Hitler. But what would have happened to Churchill, do you imagine, if there had been no Adolf Hitler and no Nazi Germany in the 1930s?
I think the answer to that is very easy. I think if there had been no Adolf Hitler and no Nazi Germany, thanks, John. Good night. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Don't worry, you know the answer. You have a surprise, but good. Happy birthday. You know the answer to this. If there had been no Hitler and no Nazi, I would be interested to hear what Paul thinks. I think obviously I'm assuming there would still have been Soviet communism, and I think Churchill would have directed his alarm, his fire at that threat, and he would have made, and rightly, he would have seen that was the existential threat to security in Europe. And he would have campaigned against that, is my view. So I don't think, so the question sort of invites us to speculate that he wouldn't have been important in the councils of the nations. On the contrary, I think he still would have been fantastically important. One of the things that really comes through if you study the life of Churchill in any depth is how much he achieved before 1940, what a colossal character he was, even without the Second World War. Whatever had happened in the 30s and 40s, he would have been at the very top of British politics, and everybody recognized that. They saw his stellar quality, his fantastic intelligence. And I think in many ways the surprise about Churchill is not that he became Prime Minister finally in 1940, but that he hadn't become Prime Minister before. Because from his very earliest career, people were pointing their finger at this guy and saying, what an amazing guy. Here comes Winston Churchill with his 100-horsepower mind. He was recognized as being the absolute star of his generation. So I think the issue would have been communism, and he would have been in the lead.
You agree? When I got wind of this question, I started thinking, well, he'd be rendered irrelevant. The world is going on peacefully, and there's no need for Winston. And so he'd be, maybe on the backbenches. Then I thought, well, he might have re-ratted as the economic situation and poverty, and since there's no post-war Britain under that scenario, but there still is a declining coal industry, and I see him going back to his liberal roots of 30, 40 years earlier, and pushing through or coordinating with labor in the late 40s and 50s, which would have been a great time for Britain and the empire, again, absent war. But I also agree with Boris. From 1918 to the late 20s, he was a dog on a bone on the Bolsheviks, and he would have reverted to that, rightly so. By 1938 or 9, how many millions of Ukrainians had died? Stalin had executed all of his generals, which in the scenario of no war wouldn't have cost him much, but in reality almost cost him his country. So I think Churchill would have been on the make and on the move, and
yeah.
I think the third or fourth issue of Time magazine back in the 20s put him on the cover. But they called him undependable, a genius but not dependable. And then they paraded out all of his enemies who said he's not dependable. But that's the type of guy that even back then would put on the cover of Time magazine.
That's right.
But I think he would have been around well into the 40s and 50s and had become Prime Minister.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Well, I'm glad. I'm happy you do, so that we can settle this peacefully instead of going outside.
Many of the people throughout Churchill's career who pointed a finger at him as saying that he was unreliable were his fellow Tories. He was extremely unpopular with his own party throughout his term. Even as Prime Minister, they weren't that thrilled with him. At least until he saved the world. Today, the Tories claim Churchill as their own, and the Labour and Liberal parties in Great Britain, I believe, both basically say, take him. Do you think that the Churchill factor can be appreciated by other than the Conservative Party?
Well, I'm not certain that I completely accept the thesis, by the way, because I think that some Labour people do try to claim, it was Labour that put Churchill in. They still say that, which I don't think, by the way, is true. They try to say that, and I was on and liberals still try to say, that the foundation of the welfare state, the stuff that Paul was talking about earlier on, the invention of the tea break, which he gave to British industry, not necessarily a wholly benign thing. The liberals try and claim that, but your questions, there's a fundamental sort of truth beneath it, which is that he is today, and this is one of the reasons for doing the book, and one of the reasons it's great to see such a big audience here tonight. He is today receding from us in history, and he's becoming more controversial and less acceptable to polite opinion. And that is because some of the things he said and did are now thought to be just beyond the pale by today's standards. And some of the language he used, some of his attitudes, he was an imperialist, he was racist, and so on and so forth. And it is vital that we fight that nonsense and that we reclaim him and that we show that he was a guy who was there for the entire country and for the entire human race. And he was. When he's at the colonial office, he is, and when he's before the First World War, his first job in the Liberal government, he's viscerally hostile to some of the brutality of the empire, what a guy called Lugard is doing in West Africa, massacring the natives, and he can't stand it. And indeed, as a young man, when he goes out to report on the war in Sudan, he's horrified by what Kitchener does to the dervishes. These are not the words of a racist imperialist warmonger. We cannot allow him to be convicted of that. And again, I mean, look at all the great things that he did for the betterment of the people of Britain. You know, unemployment insurance, a living wage for people working in certain sweated industries. You know, he really cared, and he tried to make a huge difference. So I think the Liberals and the Labour Party who fail to try to claim his mantle are fools. I'm delighted that it's left to the Conservatives to do so, but I think we should poke firmly in the eye all those who now say that Winston Churchill's views were unacceptable. I think you can, in virtually every case, with the possible exception of the Bengal famine and his general attitude to Indian independence, I think you can make a great case for his humanity and his greatness of soul. So, viva Churchill is what I would say, and don't let them do him down today.
Yeah, I think he definitely transcends political conservative, Tory, Labour, Liberal. William Manchester used to caution people against generational chauvinism, as he called it, of us judging people 70, 80 years ago by our standards. That's insane. It gets you nowhere. So some of Churchill's statements about blacks, Jews, Italians, Catholics, they're whoppers. You could fill a book with them. And when I was researching the third volume, I knew I had to be careful. I didn't want to lecture the reader and say, don't judge him. I just threw it out there. But the telegrams that Franklin Roosevelt sent, if an American president today talked about the Iranians and the Italians and the Polish and the Jews and the Irish, as Roosevelt did, and Dean Acheson, and all of them, all of the time, there'd be a scandal. But Churchill, I agree so much, the spirituality, the humanity, the humanism of Churchill, he saved Western civilization, which on the left, on the right, people like Pat Buchanan will say he started the war that saved West. It's just rubbish. But I found over the last year, I received messages from Governor Deval Patrick, Massachusetts. He is not a conservative. John Kerry was reading The Last Lion during the World Series last year. Jim Webb called it one of his favorite books of the year. Once you leave the caucus politics behind, at least in this country, people on the left, the far left, see Churchill for what he was. Not a Tory or someone who wouldn't, work with the Democratic Party as we know it today, but as a great humanitarian. And he did, and Boris is absolutely right here, Churchill despised complex systems of academic economics, and it was just simple. What's the problem? Let's fix it. And it always came down to individual people. Throughout the Blitz, he'd have his car stopped and he'd get out when people were queued up for water or biscuits, and he'd join the line and he'd talk to people. And it wasn't a photo opportunity. He just did it. And he did it then, and he did it 20 years earlier, and he did it 20 years later. So I think he doesn't belong to the Tories. He belongs to the ages.
My final question. Aside from the three of us up here, who I know each of us has the Churchill factor, can you think of one other person today who has it? Gentlemen. And if not, thank you very much for coming.
I think the truth is that I don't think anybody else. I mean, in politics today, I think it's very hard. I think he was genuinely a one-off. You know, he was constructed on a different scale from politicians in our time. He was a gigantic relic, a promontory of Victorian attitudes and ambitions sticking out into the 20th century. And I think he's a great curse on modern politicians, particularly British politicians, particularly Tory politicians, who pathetically try to emulate him and wear, floppy polka-dotted bow ties or whatever. But nobody can pull it off. He was one of a kind, and I think that is just as well, because the reason Churchill was able to display his extraordinary strength was because Britain and the world faced an existential threat, and events rose to the level where it needed a man of his extraordinary caliber to cope and to respond. And thank goodness we live in duller times. But the message that Churchill had about the values that he supported and the ideas that he stood for, they are still very important today, and they are not accepted by everyone around the world. So I don't think that the Churchill factor. I can't see any politicians that possess unless the Churchill factor was some kind of powerful sun cream, Factor Churchill sun cream that you might. I don't think I can see politicians that I'm aware of who manifestly possess it. But that is probably a good thing and a reflection of the happily less disastrous times in which we live.
I agree that he was unique, and my editor reminded me, unique, one, that's it, not two or 1.5. And in our leaders in the last 50 years, international leaders, I mean, Jack Kennedy had a flash in his inaugural speech, "Ask not what America can do for you." Well, he lifted that from Churchill, who said pretty much the same words 10 years earlier, when we're doing great things in England, we are going to ask much from you and don't ask much from the government. And, so Kennedy had his moments, and Ronald Reagan at the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
And all of these people can have moments, flashes of greatness, but Churchill is like the whole finale at the Boston Pops fireworks. I mean, there are just millions of flashes. The painter, the airplane pilot, the inventor of the tank, the humanist, and he steeped himself in classical education on his own in India. I think of him less as a Victorian man than as a classical man. Yeah. He read his Euripides and his Plato, his Socrates, and he couldn't get into the finest colleges and universities, and he got into Sandhurst on his third try. But boy, was he self-educated like old Abe Lincoln. But I don't see anyone in history before, and who knows what's coming, who puts it all together like that, all together. And sometimes I used to think of him as like a slot machine with about 1,500 lemons, and they all had to come up lemons to get Churchill, and it's just not going to happen again. And if it did, the irony is, if any politician today spoke his mind or her mind like Churchill did, they'd be gone tomorrow.
They'd be denounced in a hail of twits.
Yep.
The tweets, I mean.
By twits.
They would be a disaster. I think he had a different kind of. I think there was his father and the issues in his childhood that was driving him on, and the need to make money was a big factor in his life. Let's be totally honest. But I think he had a different kind of fuel in his tank. he was able to keep going when most of us simply can't. I mean, he could, after an event like this, Churchill could go off and have a slap-up dinner with as I intend firmly to do, with red wine, with white wine, with whiskey, with brandy, yeah. And then at 10 or 10:30, when I would be frankly ready to zonk, Churchill would be able to go up to his study, pace around the room, wreathed in tobacco and alcohol, and dictate till 3 in the morning. And that was how he did it. I don't know what was going on there. You know, there's no, I don't know whether you can do that, but I don't know any modern journalist, and British journalists are a pretty hard-bitten bunch. You know, they're pretty tough, but I don't know any journalist in Britain today who can write after dinner fluently. You know, after lunch, yes. After lunch, I can write 1,000 words in an hour, no problem. But after dinner, no. It's not biologically possible. So he had something unique, something absolutely unique.
On that bacchanalian note, thank you very much for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Reid. Boris Johnson.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful to listen to you.
Enjoy your dinner.